Hey friends, welcome back to another video on this channel. Today we are doing my January part 2 wrap-up. I have 7 fiction books to talk to you about today. If you would like to see part 1 of this wrap-up, I will link that up in the cards. I think it's this side, fingers crossed. But that's where I talk about the graphic novels that I read this month, if you're interested in checking that out. So without further ado, let's get into the books. So I read 7 fiction books this month, and generally when I do these wrap-ups, I like to talk about books from the ones that I enjoyed the least to the ones that I enjoyed the most. I don't usually talk about star ratings in these wrap-ups, but I think I might try that today and see how that goes. Let me know if you enjoy hearing what star rating or what percentage I gave each book. The first book that I'm going to talk about in this wrap-up is Murder Under Her Skin by Stephen Spotwood. This came out in 2021. This is the second book in the Pentecost and Parker mystery series, following Fortune Favors the Dead that I read last year, 2 years ago. And quite enjoyed. The series features 2 female detectives and is set in the 1940s. This story is set a few years after the events of the first book. I really enjoyed Fortune Favors the Dead when I read it, however, this book fell a little bit flat for me. In this one, we uncover a mystery that's unfolding in Will's former circus family. And I think the main thing for me with this one was the characters just fell kind of flat for me, and the story, the mystery didn't really click. The 2 female detectives that we follow felt like caricatures of the versions that were in the first book. To me, it felt like the majority of the characters in this book were sort of 2D renderings of what had been 3D renderings in the first book in the series. And this wasn't something that I noticed in the first book, but I sort of picked up on it in this one, and that was that there were definite moments where it felt like, okay, this is a male writer trying to go for a quote-unquote strong female character. And while in some ways I can appreciate that, I think the reality is it felt kind of surface level and lacked some nuance for me. Granted, I've also seen female authors do this as well, but in doing this I find that the author will often sort of fall into caricature and rather than a nuanced and fully realized female character. One last note, I wasn't super plussed with how addiction was handled in this mystery. It is an element in this story, and I think it just could have been handled a little bit better. So unless I hear rave things about the next book or the next couple books in the series, I think I might press pause on this one. In the end, I gave this 2.5 out of 5 stars. Next up is Little Fish by Casey Plett. This came out in 2018 and is her debut novel. So in this book we follow Wendy, a 30-year-old trans woman who comes across evidence that her late grandfather, who was a devout Mennonite farmer, may have been transgender. At first she dismisses this idea, but as her own life and the lives of her friends around her become more and more chaotic, she becomes drawn to the idea of unraveling the secrets of her grandfather's past. I want to give folks a heads up, there is definite content warnings in this book. Alcohol and drug abuse, transphobia, as well as suicide. So I'd recommend looking up these content warnings before you read this book if you are interested. I found this book to be an intimate and at times very raw exploration of the winter of discontent of one trans woman's life, where her past and her present begin to confront each other. Overall, I thought that this was a good debut novel. There were a few points here and there where I think that it could have stood to be a little bit more honed, and I wish we had gotten just a little bit more self-reflection from our main character, Wendy. Things happen to and around her, but I was kind of craving a little bit more interior reflection for some of the stumbling blocks that Wendy as a character keeps coming up against. There are a number of scenes in this book where Wendy and her friends, who are also trans women, have really interesting and nuanced discussions about gender and presentations and moving through the world as trans women and what that experience is like. Part of me definitely wished that the story of Wendy's grandfather featured a little bit more heavily in this book, especially because it's presented as one of the main narrative points in the summary of this book that I read on the back, and I'd sort of been hoping for a little bit more delving into, I guess, transness in a historic setting. But overall I found this to be a really solid debut novel, and I will definitely be checking out more of Casey Plett's work in the future. I gave this one 3 out of 5 stars. Next on this list is We Had to Remove This Post by Hannah Bervoets. Apologies, I know she is a Dutch author. This was translated by Emma Ralt and came out in 2021. This is a chilling novel that follows a woman named Kaylee who, in desperation, takes a job as a content moderator at an unnamed social media corporation. The work itself is grueling, and she and her colleagues spend hours a day watching multiple videos, looking at images of horrific content, of hate, of violence, evaluating them against the platform's ever-changing terms of service, with supervisors breathing down their necks and timing and recording their assessments. Initially, Kaylee falls into a group of fast-made work friends and even finds a workplace romance, and for a time it seems like her life is finally coming together. But over time, the people around her at work start to break down under the psychological stress that they are constantly under. I would say there are some pretty clear signs of PTSD and trauma in some of the characters in this book. I will also mention content warning for a ton of things in this book. There are descriptions of the images and the videos that Kaylee and her colleagues are asked to review. This was a very dark and unsettling novella that was written in short, snappy, clean prose. And I also found the author's postscript to be rather haunting, and that is, quote, "This novella is a work of fiction. The characters portrayed are drawn from my imaginations. However, any resemblance to reality is not accidental." In the end, I gave this 3.5 out of 5 stars. Next up is a book that came out last year in 2022, and that is Dead Collections by Isaac Fellman. This was an unexpected mashup of a number of different things. One part nostalgic analysis of fandom and early internet culture, one part magical realism, one part philosophical musings on the nature of historic archives, and one part pulpy queer romance. I feel like this book truly defies any type of categorization or comparison to anything that I've read in the past. Our main character is a trans man named Soul who works at the queer archives in his city, who is afflicted with the disease of vampirism and who will perish at any touch of sunlight. And so as a result, for the last several years, he has been living at his office secretly, and who meets Elsie one day when she comes to donate her wife's papers to the archives. In life, Elsie's wife had been a pioneering TV show writer and runner who had created the fictional show Feet of Clay that Elsie and Soul had both adored in the 90s. Over the course of the novel, Soul and Elsie fall in love, traverse grief, reflect on the internet fandom that they once both unknowingly shared, as well as navigate the realities of transphobia and the stigmas of vampirism. We have sections of this book that are really gorgeously written, philosophical musings on the nature of archives, the physical ghosts that we leave behind. I'll read you the opening paragraph of this book just to give you a taste. "When I was training to become an archivist, my mentor told me, a thing is just a slow event. The line wasn't hers, but it struck me with a needle prick of originality. A slow event. A person is that too. An event 70 or 80 years long, very complex, hundreds of systems, iron and nitrogen and oxygen, blood flowing into blood. This story is a mystery of sorts, although most mysteries begin with a dead body. That's a thing whose event is nearly done, with its last climaxes soon to come. The dead body is always pretty rude. It comes into your life and reminds you of the joke at the end. It ruins your appetite. It ruins your day. There are no dead bodies in archives, except maybe for mine." So you have that mixed with all of these other elements that I mentioned that make for a really unique read. I don't know if I'd say that all of these elements melded in a cohesive way for me, but I'm not saying that I didn't enjoy this book. Again, I don't quite know how to categorize this story, but I think I really enjoyed it. There are definitely parts that I wanted to underline. I think I'll definitely be buying a copy of this book when I'm no longer on my book buying ban. I read it from the library, but there are definitely passages that I would like to reread and annotate. Again, this story felt very unique, very fresh, and it definitely kept me on my toes. I gave it 4 out of 5 stars. Next, let's talk about Who is Vera Kelly by Rosalie Knecht. I think that's how you say her name. This was published in 2018. This book definitely took me by surprise. I did not expect to love it as much as I did. I guess the way that I would describe this is a historic, queer, literary spy thriller, which, saying it out loud, you wouldn't think works, but it really does. I will say that this isn't a very fast-paced thriller. There is definitely political intrigue and betrayal, but the narrative itself isn't tense like, say, a Bond film is. The story is told in alternating chapters of Vera Kelly's present as well as her past, and how it has led her to where she is. I listened to this as an audiobook, and I will say that the narrator just did a phenomenal job. I really enjoyed her voice, her narration. The writing in this was really wonderful and just felt very atmospheric. So we're following Vera, who's been recruited by the CIA to be a plant in Argentina in the 1960s, where she wiretaps and transcribes the conversations of congressmen She infiltrates a student activist group in Buenos Aires and navigates the upheaval of General Ongonia's coup that happened in 1966 and his establishment of a military dictatorship. I really enjoyed this book and will definitely be listening to the next one in the series when I get a chance. I gave this one 4.5 out of 5 stars. Next, let's talk about Bonjour, Tristace by Francois Sagan. This came out in 1954, and I'm still seething about the fact that Sagan wrote this when she was 17 over the course of 2 months and was published when she was 18 years old. And when this was published, it became an international success, and Sagan went on to have a very long literary career. The book itself is set in the French Riviera in the 1950s, and we follow a precocious teenager named Cecile and her libertine bohemian father Raymond. Cecile finds her and her father's carefree lifestyle under threat when her father Raymond announces that he plans to get married. Fearing that she is being replaced in her father's heart and fighting against this notion that she needs to grow up and start to do things in a certain way, she sets about trying to break up her father's engagement. Like I said, Sagan wrote this over 2 months when she was 17, and it is infuriatingly well written. Sagan aptly depicts the brittle uncertainty of coming of age, of stepping into adulthood and having to face the idea that you might have to leave an old life and an old self behind. Bonjour, Tristesse explores the cruelty of youth, grasping for some semblance of control, for validation of the person or adult that you are becoming, willingly or not, even if you yourself have no idea who that person is supposed to be, who you want that person to be. Ended up giving Bonjour, Tristace 4.75 out of 5 stars. And last but not least, let's talk about my favorite book that I read in the month of January, and that is The Awakening by Kate Chopin. Chopin? Maybe I should have looked that name up before I said it out loud. This was originally published in 1899, and y'all, I'm really mad at myself that I haven't picked this book up until now. It's been sitting on my shelf for years. The Awakening definitely caused a rather large stir when it was first published in 1899 for its depiction of female marital infidelity. Male infidelity was totally fine to depict, no problem. Our main character, Edna Pontellier, is a young woman that is trapped in a suffocating marriage, but from the outside it looks like the ideal sort of marriage, the ideal sort of setup that someone would want. She has 2 young boys, a wealthy husband who provides for her every want and need, but in truth it is a loveless marriage. Her husband by no means sees her as an equal and expects her to conform to the Victorian archetype of the perfect mother, this angelic, selfless being who is submissive to her husband and spends nearly every waking moment thinking about and caring for her children. Someone who would have no care or want out of the domestic expectations of a woman, raising their children, keeping a wealthy household running, taking frequent social calls, and making sure that she is a credit to her husband and bolstering her husband's social currency, which in turn leads to a good image for his business. But over a summer vacation, Edna meets and develops an infatuation for a young man named Robert Lebrun. Robert and the subsequent realizations that unfold for Edna are her asserting her own personhood outside of this societal expectation that has been placed on her, this role that has been defined for her, and she is expected to perform without complaint. She realizes that she wants to live on her own, that she wants to be an artist who's able to support herself. She doesn't want to have to receive and entertain her husband's high society guests. She wants to live a life on her own terms outside of the narrow view of what has been defined for her in the society that she lives in the time period that she lives in. This book is also exquisitely written. I will read you a quote from the earlier part of the book. For the first time, she recognized the symptoms of infatuation, which she had felt impressively as a child, as a girl in her earliest teens, and later as a young woman. The recognition did not lessen the reality, the poignancy of the revelation by any suggestion or promise of instability. The past was nothing to her, offered no lesson which she was willing to heed. The future was a mystery which she never attempted to penetrate. The present alone was significant, was hers, to torture her as it was doing then, the biting conviction that she had lost that which she had held, that she had been denied that which her impassioned, newly awakened being demanded. Like, oh my goodness. There are so many other quotes that I have underlined and highlighted and annotated in this book, but I'll read you one more. There was with her a feeling of having descended in the social scale with a corresponding sense of having risen in the spiritual. Every step which she took towards relieving herself from obligations added to her strength and expansion as an individual. She began to look with her own eyes, to see and to apprehend the deeper undercurrents of life. No longer was she content to feed upon opinion when her own soul had invited her. So good. Honestly, I was blown away by this book and I've been thinking about it ever since. The edition that I have has a number of Kate Chopin's short stories, which, to be honest, I did not care for. I will note the presence of racist attitudes and ideas is somewhat present in The Awakening, but is definitely much more present in her short stories, and the theme of the lost cause and the South post-Civil War. Not a fan of that, not here for that. So I don't know if I will continue to read any more of Kate Chopin's work, depending on how present those themes are. However, The Awakening, definitely a work that had a large impact on me, that I really overall admire, and I gave it 5 out of 5 stars. So those are the 7 fiction books that I read in January. Let me know, have you read any of these? If so, what are your thoughts? Again, thank you so much for watching this video. If you liked it, you can give it a thumbs up. That apparently helps. And I think I'm gonna wrap this up, friends, and I will see you in my next video. Bye.